More troops, more resources, and more attention. Those are the principles of the new U.S. policy in Afghanistan as its so-called exit strategy is taking shape. But would it work, and how? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Garda. Taking control in Afghanistan. Richard Holbrooke, the U.S. Special Representative to the region, has been talking to senior EU and NATO officials about a new strategy in the war. The new policy will be published next week, and Holbrooke has been in Brussels canvassing opinion on its direction. Barack Obama has already announced that an extra 17,000 troops will be sent to Afghanistan in the coming months. His administration also hopes to strengthen the Afghan police force, which Holbrooke has identified as a weak link in the country's security. The new policy will also target drug trafficking. The trade has flourished despite international attempts to intervene. And Holbrooke's reported to have been stressing the importance of the new approach to include Pakistan. The country is seen as key to the future of peace in the region. Well, the policy will focus on Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, both of which are believed to find shelter and support in Pakistan. Despite recent suggestions that Barack Obama is willing to open some sort of dialogue with more moderate members of the Taliban, the new president says these groups should be a priority for United States forces.
We can't lose sight of what our central mission is, the same mission that we had when we went in after 9/11. And that is, these folks can project violence against the United States citizens, and that is something that we cannot tolerate. But what we can't do is think that just a military approach in Afghanistan is going to be able to solve our problems. So what we're looking for is a comprehensive strategy, and there's got to be an exit strategy.
Well, joining us today are our guests in Washington, D.C., Lawrence Korb, a senior fellow at American Progress and senior advisor to the Center for Defense Information. Also in D.C., Hilary Mann Leverett, former Afghanistan and Iran director for the National Security Council at the White House and the State Department. And in Kabul, Haidar Akbar, senior analyst at the Center for Conflict and Peace Studies in Kabul, Afghanistan. Thank you all of you for joining us. Mr. Korb, if I could start off with you. A 17,000-man troop surge plus planning for an exit strategy. It sounds like a serious contradiction, doesn't it?
Not really, because until you get the security situation under control, particularly in the South, you're not going to be able to achieve your goals that are going to let you get out.
Hilary Mann Leverett, do you concur with that?
Well, you know, I think Iraq showed us exactly what Dr. Korb said, that you do need to get a security situation improved before you can think about how you're going to exit. If we exit without having any relation to security, we are just we're saying that our goals were mistaken to begin with, and that we do not have any current goals, which leaves a tremendous power vacuum in the area.
But on the one hand, the United States wants to talk to the more moderate members of the Taliban. On the other, the Taliban will treat any additional foreign force as an enemy, as an occupying, hostile enemy, no matter how sincere the intention. So, I mean, don't the two contradict each other?
They certainly do. I think that if we do not have a clear plan, a clear exit strategy, I think the Taliban and others, including President Karzai, can use not just the continued and increased U.S. troop presence, but the continued U.S. aerial bombardment with the civilian casualties it engenders as a very powerful anti-American tool inside Afghanistan. So we have to be very, very careful to make sure there is a clear exit strategy articulated.
Haidar Akbar, from the Afghan point of view, is there a perception that there is a clear plan, or is it all muddy and murky?
I would say at this point, Afghans are still looking forward to what this new report is going to say and what it entails for Afghanistan and our future here. I think most Afghans are concerned, especially with the recent rhetoric coming out, and wondering what it means for Afghanistan in our future. In terms of an exit strategy, I think most people fear here that they want an exit strategy that leaves Afghanistan stable and not an exit strategy that sort of cleans or cleanses their hands of Afghanistan. I think that is a major concern of most people in Afghanistan.
Lawrence Korb, is it a realistic fear that this war could be Barack Obama's, rather his Vietnam?
Well, I know people have analogies to Vietnam. They also have historical analogies to what happened to the Soviets and to the British in Afghanistan. But I think the fact that he's doing a review at the beginning of his administration, and also, as you pointed out in the run-up, that Ambassador Holbrooke's consulting with our NATO allies, we are not going to be there alone, for example, as we pretty much were in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, we never quite understood what our goals would be. And I think it's important, if you look at the opinion polls in Afghanistan, where you have a lot of foreign troops, you also have very little support for the Taliban. So I think the idea that if you put more troops in, automatically that increases the support among the Afghanistan people for the Taliban is not quite true.
You mentioned opinion polls, and I think it would be interesting to mention some USA Today and Gallup polls earlier this week, because one analogy that could be with Vietnam is that as Vietnam went along, the American people were more and more against the war. 42% of respondents in this Gallup poll, American citizens, said the war in Afghanistan was a mistake. Now, the same poll was done in January 2002, and only 6% of people then thought it was the wrong idea. So from 6% to 42% over this period of 7 years, that's a vote of no confidence in the war from the American people, isn't it, Mr. Korb?
There's no doubt about the fact that the American people are not as supportive of the war as they once were. And I think that's because of the fact that basically it's been neglected ever since 2002, when we decided to focus the attention of the government and the military on Iraq. And now that they're focusing on it, they're saying, well, you know, nobody told us it was getting this bad, you know, and how did this happen? But again, if you take a look, I mean, the level of casualties among Americans in Afghanistan, while it's higher than it was early on in the war, nowhere equates to that in Vietnam. I mean, in Vietnam, we ended up losing, you know, 50,000 American lives. Here we're talking, you know, in the hundreds so far. So I think if the American people feel that there's a clear plan and there is an exit strategy, then I think that those numbers will go up.
Haider Akbar, what do you make of that? That 42% of the Americans polled felt that the war was a mistake. It's quite startling, isn't it?
It's not. I think it's a reaction to what they're seeing right now happening in Afghanistan. I think they're becoming increasingly apprehensive about what we can achieve in Afghanistan. But that being said, I think that most of what has happened in Afghanistan has been a result of neglect and has been a result of the fact that we had to play second fiddle to Iraq. And many of the developments that occurred in the early years, in 2002 to 2005, were not taken serious. I don't think that the threats cannot be faced in Afghanistan if we give adequate resources and a structure and a policy to these additional resources that takes into account an Afghan point of view. I think that is another fear that a lot of people have here. You have President Obama talking to a lot of the NATO allies, but there's certain fears that, you know, again, Afghanistan and the Afghans themselves haven't been engaged properly, and I think that's going to be key as well, to engage the Afghan people and see what they want for the future of Afghanistan and what they think the future of Afghanistan should look like.
Ms. Mann-Leverett, is it an issue of money as well? Is there credibility to the theory that perhaps because the U.S. economy is in such tatters that maybe Barack Obama is saying, let's cut and run?
Well, I think there may be an economic issue here in terms of, in Washington, there's I think a growing belief that there's an economic component here, that the U.S. must economically lift Afghanistan up from its current state. That's not going to be possible with the state of the U.S. economy, and that's also not what we learned from Iraq. What we learned from Iraq was that it was not an economic issue. It didn't matter how many billions of dollars the U.S. poured into Iraq. It was a political and security question that led to a decreased sense of violence there. I'd like to come back too on Afghanistan, not just to the economic component, but again to the U.S. military presence and this idea that there's been neglect. Of course there's been neglect, and the U.S. was diverted by President Bush to Iraq. But the U.S. has been present with over 30,000 troops in Afghanistan this whole time. And a big problem with the U.S. troop presence has been its almost indiscriminate policy towards civilians. The aerial bombardment of civilians in Afghanistan has been a major problem inside Afghanistan, particularly for Karzai, with a growing sense of unease among the population and concern about what the U.S. is doing there. And I want to just give an example of this, of how important it is and how tragic it is. When I was at the White House dealing with Afghan policy, we would get repeated reports that at Afghan weddings, the U.S. would bomb the Afghan weddings because Afghans would shoot into the air with their rifles. We should have been able to learn that in 2001, 2002, that we didn't need to continue to bomb Afghan wedding parties. But here we are in 2009, and we continue to have this same problem of indiscriminate bombing that affects civilians.
And
until that changes.
Yes, it's a fair point. Sorry to
until
come in
that
there.
Changes.
Yeah, I want to pose this to Haider Akbar because it is a fair point, Haider Akbar. Therefore, the Afghan people will continually be skeptical of any foreign forces and might resort to turning to the Taliban because they're the lesser of two evils.
At this point, I think there's a very difficult circumstance for most of the Afghan people that are in these insecure areas. They're dealing with foreign forces that do not understand the local dynamics, that are susceptible to manipulation, and that are not seen as being committed. People don't know whether they're going to be here 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line. And on the other hand, you have the Taliban that are becoming increasingly brutal and are able to make inroads into these societies and into these areas and use intimidation and coercion to force the local population. So yes, it's an issue of survival for many of these people on the local level. You go against the Afghan governments and you can usually pay a bribe, or you can usually figure out a way to get out. You go against the Taliban, you might be beheaded the next day. So when they have these kind of choices to make every day, it is becoming increasingly difficult for them to be able to engage the foreign forces, especially in these insecure areas. And of course, civilian casualties has been a huge factor to this. But not only civilian casualties, I would like to add another point to that. The detaining of individuals, especially Afghans here, has also been a serious issue. The torture cases that have emerged at Bagram. I myself had once turned in a detainee from my own home province in Kannauj. We went together to the American base in Asadabad, and 3 days later I had to go and pick up his body because he was beaten to death. So these kind of cases do not help the American presence in this area, and that's why I say an increased troop presence, increased resources will only work if we really genuinely look at the mistakes that we have made in the past and create some kind of policy that helps to deal with these issues.
Okay.
Otherwise, we will have a very difficult time in Afghanistan, and the issues we face in Afghanistan, we'll face them on a grander scale with more resources.
Okay, it is time for a short break. When we come back, we'll also talk about the Afghan president, Hamid Karzai, and ask, is he still relevant to the United States' plans in his country? Stay with Inside Story.